The courthouse records in Lancaster County note 4 unusual deaths between 1837 and 1841. An attorney fell from his horse on a foggy morning. A banker was pulled from the shallow waters of Mill Creek. A circuit judge collapsed from sudden illness during harvest, and the county sheriff was found at the bottom of his own well. What the records never mentioned was that all 4 men had married sisters from the same Irish Catholic family, and each death came within a year and a half of their wedding day. The Brennan sisters, Bridget, Catherine, Margaret, and Sarah, inherited the largest farm in Lancaster County, and they would do anything to keep it intact. The story truly began in the summer of 1836, when the sisters lit a candle in their kitchen and made a pact that sealed the fate of 4 respected men. Their father, Patrick Brennan, had spent nearly 4 decades turning 847 acres of Pennsylvania farmland into a dynasty. His land stretched from Mill Creek to the Lancaster Pike, with a stone house grand enough to rival Philadelphia mansions. Barns large enough for 200 cattle and silos that could keep half the county fed through winter. But when Patrick died in October 1836, the law required his land to be divided equally among his children. He had no sons, only 4 daughters, and splitting the farm meant destroying the very thing he had built. The Brennan sisters, raised on his fierce belief that land was blood and soul, were determined not to let that happen. Bridget, the eldest at 28, was sharper than she let on managing the books since her father's eyesight began to fail. Catherine, 26, had a gift for reading people with uncanny accuracy. Margaret, 24, was blessed with beauty and a hidden ruthlessness, while Sarah, just 21, could charm anyone and play any part needed. Together, they faced a future where taxes would strip their inheritance within 2 years, and marriage would scatter them into separate households. Unless Bridget argued marriage could be turned into a weapon instead of a weakness. One November night, frost covering the windows, Bridget told her sisters that no matter what, they must stay together and keep the farm whole. Margaret reminded her that the law said otherwise. But Catherine hinted that laws could be bent. It was Sarah, the youngest, who spoke the words that would guide their path. Men die, husbands die, and widows inherit. The first to fall was Thomas Hennessy, Lancaster's leading attorney, who married Bridget 6 months after Patrick's death. A wealthy widower in his 40s, Hennessy had seemed the perfect match, respected Catholic, rich enough to cover the farm's taxes and influential enough to reshape their debts. To him, Bridget was more than a farmer's daughter. She was intelligent, graceful, and capable of discussing legal precedents as easily as she charmed his dinner guests. Their match looked like the perfect union of love and strategy. But on March 15, 1838, just 14 months after Patrick's funeral, Hennessy was dead. And so the pattern began. 2 months after meeting Bridget Brennan at Sunday Mass, Thomas Hennessy was certain she was the answer to his lonely prayers. Their December 1837 wedding was one of the grandest Lancaster County had seen, signaling that the Brennan family's fortunes were safe. Hennessy moved into the stone farmhouse, bringing both wealth and the legal expertise to build a family trust that secured the farm for all 4 sisters. The arrangement was clever, airtight, and perfectly lawful. But Thomas had no idea he was stepping into a household where loyalty to blood outweighed loyalty to marriage. From the start, Bridget made it clear that her sisters came first. Catherine, Margaret, and Sarah remained in the farmhouse, turning the supposed honeymoon period into a family gathering. When Thomas hinted at privacy, Bridget's reply was chilling in its finality. Her sisters stayed no matter what. Things worsened when Thomas realized Bridget was quietly using his legal network to investigate the finances of Lancaster's most eligible men. She insisted it was for her sisters' futures, but the precision with which she sought information suggested calculation rather than care. On the foggy morning of March 15th, 1838, their marriage reached its breaking point. Thomas presented Bridget with an offer to buy a law practice in Philadelphia, a career-making step that would require leaving Lancaster. Bridget's refusal was immediate and absolute. "We don't leave. We don't separate ever," she told him, her voice flat and her expression cold enough to unnerve a man known for facing juries without fear. He rode out toward Lancaster town in heavy fog. At 9:30, his horse returned alone, trembling and drenched in sweat. 3 hours later, neighbors found Thomas's body beside the road, his neck broken, his chest bruised where the panicked horse had trampled him. The coroner ruled it a tragic accident, a skilled rider, undone by bad luck and poor visibility. Yet those who knew him well whispered doubts. Thomas was too seasoned in the saddle to fall so carelessly, and the horse's terror seemed too great for a simple stumble. Bridget wept, accepted condolences, and buried her husband with grace, befitting a grieving widow. But her focus quickly shifted to securing the will and consolidating assets. To the public eye, she was devastated. To those who looked closer, she was prepared. Within weeks of the funeral, Catherine Brennan began attending social events with Hamilton Crawford, the county's most powerful banker. Crawford, a wealthy widower in his late 30s, had money influence and the trust of Lancaster's farming class. Catherine approached him with a balance of fragility and determination that no lonely man of wealth could resist. What began as polite company soon unfolded into a courtship that mirrored Bridget setting the stage for another marriage and another fatal twist of fate. Catherine Brennan played her role with precision. On Tuesday afternoons, she appeared at Hamilton Crawford's bank at first, under the guise of settling financial matters after Thomas Hennessy's death. But business slowly gave way to quiet confidences and sympathetic glances. She spoke of her sisters with a practiced tenderness Bridget lost in mourning Margaret and Sarah, in need of strong guidance. "A woman alone faces dangers you cannot imagine," she told him, her voice soft enough to draw him closer. For a man without siblings, who had long wondered what true family loyalty might feel like, Catherine's devotion was intoxicating. By August 1838, their engagement was public knowledge. 2 months later, on the anniversary of Patrick Brennan's death, and just 7 months after Hennessy's funeral, Catherine wed Lancaster County's most powerful banker. Crawford moved into the farmhouse, bringing his fortune and his gift for management, reshaping the family's accounts with the same confidence he applied to his bank. Like Hennessy, he never questioned the sisters' unbreakable unity. Yet unlike Hennessy, Crawford had a habit of recording his thoughts. His private journal soon filled with troubling notes. In November, he observed that Margaret and Sarah showed no interest in suitors despite their age and beauty, while Bridget displayed an alarming grasp of inheritance law. By December, he was convinced the sisters had sworn some kind of pact to keep their father's farm undivided. His entries grew darker as Catherine herself turned distant, speaking more like a business partner than a wife. "The 4 of us are family enough," she said coldly when he suggested starting their own household. What truly disturbed him was Margaret's sudden association with Judge Cornelius Whitman, the very man whose rulings could determine the legality of the sisters' property holdings. The banker saw the pattern clearly, but he mistook awareness for protection. On February 8th, 1839, with Lancaster locked in the grip of its coldest winter in memory, Crawford set out on one of his habitual walks along the property line. The Mill Creek, frozen solid for the first time in decades, tempted him with what looked like safe passage. Sometime that morning, the ice gave way. His body was pulled from the water hours later, wedged against a log nearly a quarter-mile downstream. His death ruled a tragic accident brought on by freezing currents. Yet the journal he left behind told another story. The final entry, dated February 7th, carried a warning that now reads like an epitaph. Catherine knows I suspect something. Hamilton Crawford's final journal entries painted a picture of a man who saw the storm too late. He wrote of Catherine's constant presence, how she followed him with concern that felt more like surveillance. He resolved to confront her about Hennessy's death and left a warning for anyone who might read his words. If something happened to him, the sisters should be blamed. Yet when his body was recovered from Mill Creek, the coroner, Dr. Mallister, dismissed the drowning as a simple accident of ice in winter. No signs of struggle, no wounds, no proof of anything sinister. To the public, it was another cruel twist of fate. Catherine wept at his funeral just as Bridget had before her, but the sisters quickly turned their energy to meetings with lawyers and bankers, securing every thread of their financial position. Lancaster County whispered, but no one dared speak too loudly against respectable widows. Then only 6 weeks later came the announcement that Margaret Brennan would marry Judge Cornelius Whitman. At 53, Whitman stood at the summit of his career, a circuit court judge whose rulings shaped lives from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. He was considered a man destined for the state Supreme Court, a pillar of authority and respect. Margaret's pursuit of him was subtle, almost artful. She began by appearing in his courtroom in March 1839, posing as a confused young woman, overwhelmed by inheritance law. Her beauty caught his eye, but it was her seeming innocence laced with just enough intelligence to keep her questions engaging that drew him in. "My sisters and I only want to honor our father's wishes," she told him, eyes wide with earnestness. But the law seems designed to tear families apart rather than protect them. Whitman, who had grown weary of selfish relatives clawing over estates, saw in Margaret a rare devotion to family. Soon their conversations drifted from property disputes to literature philosophy, and the judge's own loneliness since his wife's death years earlier. Margaret's method was patience. She never pressed for meetings, never hinted at romance. She played the part of a grateful young woman seeking wisdom, while gently weaving herself into the empty spaces of his life. By May 1839, when their engagement was announced, Lancaster society was stunned. Some muttered about the unsettling pattern: 3 sisters, 3 wealthy suitors, 2 sudden deaths, but Whitman himself seemed reborn, smiling and hopeful for the first time in years. Margaret filled his austere world with charm and curiosity. She studied his cases, remembered names and details with uncanny precision, and most disarming of all, appeared to share his unease about the tragedy surrounding her family. "I worry about my sisters," she whispered to him in confidence just weeks before their wedding. "Bridget and Catherine have not been themselves since their husbands passed. Sometimes I fear the grief has changed them." To Whitman, it sounded like the voice of a woman caught between love for her family and fear of its shadow. To Lancaster County, it was the beginning of the 3rd act in a story that had already claimed 2 lives. By the summer of 1839, Margaret Brennan had secured what her sisters could not: a husband whose influence reached beyond Lancaster County into the highest circles of Pennsylvania law. Yet Judge Cornelius Whitman, unlike his predecessors, brought with him the discipline of a lifetime spent weighing evidence and questioning motives. The July wedding was modest, a subdued affair, overshadowed by whispers of misfortune that clung to the Brennan sisters like smoke. Whitman split his time between his townhouse in Lancaster and the farmhouse, an arrangement that gave him perspective on both his professional duties and the strange rhythms of his new household. Within weeks, he began to keep a private record, more analytical than Crawford's melancholy journal, more clinical than Hennessy's correspondence. August 10th, Margaret insists on knowing my every movement under the pretense of planning meals and visits. Her concern feels less like affection, more like surveillance. August 25th overheard Bridget and Catherine speaking of the final arrangement. Both silenced themselves when I entered. Margaret's reaction, fearful, almost staged, troubles me. September 2nd discovered Margaret studying my will. She claimed ignorance of the law, but her questions were too exacting, her knowledge too precise. September 15th confronted her directly. She wept, denied all suspicion. If genuine, she is a prisoner of her sister's schemes. If false, she is a far better actress than I realized. As a judge, Whitman had access to records others could not easily obtain. Quietly, he requested the coroner's reports on Hennessy and Crawford. Both men had quarreled with their wives shortly before their deaths. Both accidents occurred at moments of tension over whether to remain in Lancaster. Both men had recently altered their wills to heavily favor their widows. Patterns of timing and opportunity emerged that the coroner had overlooked or ignored. What unsettled him more was the discovery that someone else had begun asking the same questions. A private investigator, Daniel Murphy, had traveled through Lancaster that autumn, interviewing neighbors, examining records, and quietly probing into the Brennan sisters' financial affairs. Murphy's sudden departure left behind a trail of uneasy testimony and unanswered questions. By October 30th, Judge Whitman could no longer contain his suspicions. That evening, with rain lashing against the farmhouse windows and Catherine and Sarah absent in Lancaster town, he confronted Margaret in the parlor. The fire snapped in the grate, throwing restless shadows across her pale face. As he laid out the evidence, Crawford's drowned body, Hennessy's broken neck, the wills, the patterns, the timing. His voice, steady in court, cracked with quiet fury. "Tell me, Margaret," he demanded, "are you your sister's accomplice or their prisoner?" Margaret's tears came quickly, as they always did, her hands trembling as she clutched at his sleeve. Her words, soft and halting, could later be read as confession denial or something between. "You don't understand, Cornelius," she whispered. "We do what we must to keep the family whole." Margaret fell apart in the parlor, then through ragged breaths laid out the plan that had been stitched together in the wake of their father's funeral. Bridget had designed it all, a cold, calculated scheme to marry well, and then turn those marriages into inheritance. And the sisters had rehearsed every step until it looked like fate instead of design. She explained that Bridget taught them to think like men, to be patient and unseen, and that what the town would call grieving widows was meant to hide months of preparation, down to drugging a morning cup of coffee and startling a horse at the precise bend in the road. Catherine had watched Mill Creek through the winter, finding the thin ice above a hidden spring, then weakened it further with heated iron so the collapse would look like an accident, and Margaret admitted she had been forced into complicity by threats to pin the crimes on her alone if she refused. She told Whitman that they had practiced doses of a slow-acting poison until Sarah found the right balance to mimic a fatal heart attack, that the sisters argued Bridget needed his death to be flawless because of his prominence, and that the private investigator Daniel Murphy was not an enemy of the family, but someone paid to sniff out trouble and report back. The confession left the judge reeling, not only from the grisly practicality of their methods, but because Margaret disclosed the date they had set for him, November 15th, 1839. A date now looming like a clock counting down to a verdict only he could try to prevent. Margaret slid a key from beneath her neck and handed a leather journal to Judge Whitman, saying she had been keeping every detail since the nights after their father's funeral, and when he opened it, the room felt suddenly smaller, as if the pages themselves were closing around him. The journal began with an entry dated November 15th, 1836, where Bridget first laid out the plan to marry well and convert marriages into inheritance. And it recorded how the sisters treated target selection like strategy studying. Men's wealth habits and weaknesses, drugging a morning cup, weakening ice over a hidden spring, testing doses until the poison mimicked a natural heart attack, and even hiring a private investigator named Daniel Murphy to root out anyone asking questions so the family would always stay one step ahead. Margaret wrote honestly about her own fear and complicity, about being bullied into obedience with the threat that she would be framed if she refused. And her handwriting betrayed the strain of watching the plan move from idea to execution, noting triumph at the precise efficiency of Thomas Hennessy's death and shame at how pride had replaced grief. Yet she also confessed to secretly documenting everything in the hope that someone might use the pages to stop them. As Whitman read, the sound of horses on the lane told him Catherine and Sarah were returning, and Margaret hissed a warning that if they discovered what she had done, they would kill him that very night, leaving him holding the ledger of 3 years of calculated murders and a decision that might save or doom him. She had been their unwitting alibi, the sister whose visible distress convinced everyone that at least one Brennan was innocent and in her journal. Margaret recorded the small betrayals that became evidence of a larger plot. July 20th, 1839. Cornelius grows more suspicious each day, asking uncomfortable questions I cannot answer, without undoing everything she wrote, and Bridget replied that my marriage to a judge would force us to be more careful while shielding us from prosecution. Because who would believe a wife who confessed to her husband, or a judge fooled by his own partner? As Whitman read, horses thundered up the lane, and his wife's cheerful voice drifted toward the house, leaving him only minutes to decide how to use the damning ledger before Catherine and Sarah returned. The journal's last pages revealed that the scheme was never meant to stop at 4 deaths. Bridget talked openly of expansion meetings with Murphy about widening their reach into neighboring counties, and the fantasy of a network of widows who would turn marriage and murder into a ruthless engine of wealth and influence. But it also contained the practical map of their crimes, where evidence was hidden, how each death had been staged, and most dangerously, the exact plan for Cornelius's end. Sarah, the notes said, had perfected a foxglove tincture that would mimic heart failure when slipped into an evening brandy, 3 drops calibrated to cause chest pain and collapse within hours, and to vanish from the body within a day, while Bridget rehearsed the widow's performance to make the death seem tragic but expected. With Catherine and Sarah nearly at the door, Whitman closed the book and made his choice. He would ride to Philadelphia at dawn and take Margaret with him to tell federal investigators everything a move. Margaret met with terror, insisting that Bridget had men watching the roads and ways to make an escape look like another accident. And in that cramped parlor, the two of them realized the confrontation had become the fulcrum on which their futures and possibly their lives balanced. The parlor seemed to shrink as Catherine and Sarah stepped inside, their voices light, their laughter like knives hidden in silk. Margaret slid the journal deeper under her shawl, her face carefully neutral, while Whitman forced himself into the role of patient husband, though his pulse hammered with dread. Catherine's smile, dazzling and poisonous, filled the doorway as she announced Mrs. Henderson's gossip. Sarah trailing behind with a tray of steaming cups, the picture of innocence masking something far darker. The sisters spoke of rumors with a casual cruelty that made Whitman's stomach twist, treating whispered suspicions of murder as if they were compliments about charm or beauty. Catherine's words, "We make sure men never grow old," and burdensome, dripped with the perverse logic that killing was kindness, that widowhood was not tragedy, but triumph. Sarah, her eyes bright with false delight, offered him tea as though nothing in the world were amiss. But her glance lingered a moment too long, daring him to drink. Then came the blow that nearly unmanned him. Catherine revealed that federal investigators were already sniffing around rural Pennsylvania, noting how often young widows gained fortunes from sudden accidents. Sarah followed her tone sugary sweet, saying, A gentleman from Philadelphia had been asking questions about the Brennan sisters by name, including the circumstances of Thomas Hennessy and Hamilton Crawford, and most dangerously about his own marriage. The trap was closing. Daniel Murphy had fed them everything, and the sisters knew federal eyes were on them. Margaret's fingers dug into Whitman's hand, hard enough to hurt a pressure that might have been desperation or performance. He felt her tremble, but whether it was fear for his life, or fear that her act would falter, he could not tell. One thing was clear. The Brennan conspiracy was no longer a family secret whispered in candlelight. It was a storm drawing the attention of the nation's lawmen, and if he misplayed his next move, he would not live to see the morning. The parlor hung heavy with silence after Sarah's sing-song summons, the kind of silence a courtroom knew in the split second before a verdict was spoken. Whitman's mind raced. 27 years of weighing men's fates in the balance of law had never prepared him for this moment, where his own life depended on a decision made in seconds. Margaret clutched his sleeve, her eyes wide with the same desperate hope he had seen in condemned men pleading for mercy. If they walked into that kitchen, they would be swallowed whole by Bridget's command, by Catherine's calculating charm, by Sarah's lethal innocence. If they fled through the back door, they might buy themselves hours, maybe days. But every road was watched, every ally compromised. Bridget had planned for betrayal just as she had planned for accidents, wills, and funerals. The vial of foxglove weighed like a stone in Whitman's pocket, proof of Margaret's choice or proof of her skill at deception. The journal under her shawl could destroy the sisters or serve as bait for the trap about to spring. His duty as a judge told him to preserve the evidence, deliver it to federal authorities, and end the sisters' reign of calculated widowhood. But his instincts as a man facing 3 predators whispered that stepping into that kitchen meant certain death. Outside, the November wind rattled the shutters like a warning. Inside, Bridget's voice carried with a sharpened edge, Margaret Cornelius now. It was no longer an invitation, but a command. Whitman tightened his grip on Margaret's hand, his mind narrowing to 2 irreconcilable truths. To confront them was to risk his life. To run was to abandon his oath and leave Lancaster County at the mercy of killers who were already plotting beyond its borders. The judge who had always believed in justice now stood at the threshold of survival, caught between the gallows and the open road. And with the sound of footsteps approaching the parlor, he knew the choice could no longer be delayed. The Brennans froze only for an instant, then Bridget's mask snapped back into place, her eyes shining with crocodile tears as she rushed forward to greet the lawmen. "Thank God you've come," she cried, her voice breaking with practiced desperation. "My poor sister has been trapped in a nightmare. This man, Judge Whitman, he's been plotting against us all, killing the very men who cared for our family and forcing us to conceal his crimes." Catherine and Sarah flanked her like a pair of choristers echoing the lead singer's refrain, nodding along, their faces pale with staged horror. For a heartbeat, Whitman felt the noose slip around his own neck. It was the perfect reversal. The widow's innocent victims at last pointing trembling fingers at the judge whose profession made him the easiest scapegoat. The marshal's eyes darted between Bridget's performance and Whitman's rigid stance, hands clenched at his sides, jaw set like a man already on trial. Then Margaret stepped forward. She pulled the shawl from her shoulders and placed the hidden leather-bound journal squarely on the parlor table. "No," she said, her voice cracking but firm. "Not this time." She slid the foxglove vial beside it, glass catching the torchlight. "Here is the record of every murder. Here is the poison they plan to use on my husband tonight. I will testify to every word, every plan, every lie." For the first time, Bridget faltered. Fury rippled across her face, raw and unhidden. "You treacherous little fool," she hissed, lunging as though to snatch the journal back. but a marshal's rifle stopped her cold. Sarah's sweet mask collapsed into animal hatred, while Catherine's composure slipped into a predator's snarl. The three sisters stood exposed, their charm burned away in the glare of federal authority. The lead marshal lifted the journal, flipping through page after page of Margaret's meticulous hand, his jaw tightening as the weight of evidence grew. He looked at Whitman, then at Margaret, and gave the smallest nod. The balance had shifted. Bridget Brennan, Catherine Brennan, Sarah Brennan, he declared, voice echoing in the farmhouse. You are under arrest for conspiracy and multiple counts of murder. Bridget straightened, her fury cooling into something darker. Do you really think chains will hold us? She whispered, her eyes fixed on Whitman with a promise of vengeance. Men like you never understand. You may win tonight, Judge, but women like us, we always find a way. As iron shackles closed around the Brennan sisters' wrists, Whitman felt Margaret's hand slip into his. For the first time since stepping into that cursed farmhouse, he believed survival was possible. But Bridget's words lingered in the air, heavy as prophecy, a reminder that the Brennan sisters' conspiracy was larger than one farm, larger than Lancaster County, and perhaps far from finished. Marshal Davies stood like a stone figure in the farmhouse parlor, his men fanning out to secure every doorway. The air stank of wood smoke, damp wool, and the sweat of fear. His announcement of Whitman's arrest had been the sisters' final gambit. Their attempt to flip the law against its own servant, but Margaret's trembling voice and Murphy's betrayal of his employers shifted the balance. The mask of sainthood Bridget had worn for 3 years cracked, and the venom beneath seeped through. Sarah's outburst confirmed everything, her slip of the tongue exposing the rotten core they had all tried to hide. Catherine still clung to her role, her face glowing with manufactured innocence. But the sharp edge in her eyes betrayed the panic of a woman calculating exit strategies, even as irons closed in. Bridget, however, stood defiant. Her words poured out not as a defense, but as a manifesto. She claimed mercy where others saw murder, painting her crimes as deliverance, her victims as lucky men spared the indignities of age and ruin. Whitman's mind spun as Davies' revelations took shape. Margaret had been the hidden fulcrum all along. She had fed evidence to Murphy, recorded the conspiracy with painstaking care, and played the role of reluctant accomplice until the weight of her sister's ambition threatened to crush her soul. He saw now that her tears that night had not been solely for him, but for the years she had spent balancing on a knife edge between survival and damnation. The marshals moved swiftly, chains biting into pale wrists, the clink of iron punctuating Bridget's final words. Catherine tried to protest, her voice rising in elegant outrage, but was silenced by a shove toward the door. Sarah sobbed, not the sweet tinkling laugh she had used to mask her cruelty, but the guttural wail of a cornered predator. Bridget alone went quietly, her head high, her voice steady as she offered one last poisonous sermon. We gave them love, she told Davies, her words cutting through the storm outside. We gave them joy and peace in their final days. Can you say the same for the women left with drunkards, cowards, and broken men? We didn't murder, we perfected widowhood. And when history remembers us, it will be as pioneers, not monsters. Davies gave her no answer. With the slam of the farmhouse door and the march of boots into the night, the Brennan sisters' reign ended in iron and torchlight. Yet even as they were hauled away, Whitman felt Bridget's gaze burn into him, a silent vow that her story was not finished, that Lancaster County had only witnessed the first chapter of a much darker saga. As the Brennan sisters were dragged out into the night, their words lingered like poison in the air. Claims that they were not monsters, but visionaries who had turned murder into mercy and widowhood into power. Judge Cornelius Whitman, his heart still pounding from the narrow escape, understood that Margaret's decision to betray her sisters had saved not only his life, but perhaps dozens of others. Left unchecked, Bridget's plan for a network of widows could have spread far beyond Pennsylvania, turning quiet farms and grand houses across the mid-Atlantic into theaters of death. The trial in Philadelphia transfixed the nation. Newspapers from New York to Washington printed every salacious detail of the conspiracy, dubbing it the Widow's Plot. Courtrooms overflowed with spectators eager to see the three surviving Brennan sisters who faced charges of murder and conspiracy. Bridget, Catherine, and Sarah met the proceedings with the same calculated poise they had shown in Lancaster, though each verdict chipped away at their composure. The jury found them guilty on all counts, making them the first women in Pennsylvania history to receive death sentences for such crimes. On March 15, 1841, 3 years to the day after Thomas Hennessy's so-called accident, the three sisters were hanged side by side before a crowd that stretched into the thousands. Margaret Brennan Whitman avoided their fate. Her testimony and the journals she had kept since 1836 secured her immunity. She and her husband slipped away after the trial, vanishing into Ohio under assumed names, determined to bury the past. The Brennan farm was dismantled, its profits directed to the families of the victims, and the once mighty stone farmhouse was torn down, leaving only whispers and rumors in its place. Yet the story refused to die. In later years, investigators uncovered records of similar accidents in Maryland, Virginia, and Delaware cases, involving young widows' sudden deaths and suspicious inheritances. None were definitively tied to the Brennans, but the parallels suggested that Bridget's vision had already spread, inspiring others to cloak greed and violence in the language of loyalty and love. The case reshaped American law, setting new precedents for pursuing organized conspiracies within families and widening the lens through which authorities viewed inheritance-related crimes. It also forced a reckoning with society's blind spots, the dangerous assumption that women bound by domestic roles were incapable of orchestrating systematic brutality. Today, the Brennan farm exists only as asphalt and storefronts, a shopping center where most locals shop unaware of the blood-soaked history beneath their feet. But among historians and storytellers, the Brennan name still carries a chill. Their tale endures as a warning: evil does not always wear a villain's face. Sometimes it smiles like a sister, weeps like a widow, and hides in plain sight behind the fragile masks of family and respectability. So what do you think? Did Margaret truly reveal everything? Or were there victims we'll never know about? Could conspiracies like the Brennan sisters still exist, hidden under the surface of polite society? Share your theories in the comments, and if this story unsettled you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us as we uncover more shadows from the past. After all, history's darkest secrets rarely stay buried for long.